Yeah, recording.
Excellent. So, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Marcel Kruger. I'm a German writer and translator, and I live in Ireland. And in my work, I mostly write nonfiction about history with a strong focus on family history and places. And 2 years back in 2018, I published a book named Babushka's Journey, which tells the story of my grandmother, Cecilia, or Silly, as we called her in the family, who was born in what was then the easternmost province of the German Reich, East Prussia. And she was taken in 1945 by the Red Army and spent 4 years in a forced labor camp in the Soviet Union. And because of that book, I got in touch with the two other panelists, with Lena and Michael Sagatis. And we've been talking a lot about our family histories, about the families of all the people in Europe who were affected by totalitarianism. There we go, and the whole story of the 20th century. And we all discovered that all of our families were affected by that in different aspects. And we talked about this a lot and privately, but we thought now that many people across the globe are back in lockdown, we thought it might be nice to do this kind of online chat, to do this online panel, and talk about the reasons why we tell these stories, why we think they're important, but also why we think they're important to talk about or to tell them in the first place. So why is family history something that's important for us, and especially something that happened 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago? Why is that now 100 years or 102 years after the end of the First World War? Why is that still important to talk about? So this is the reason for this talk that we're going to have. In terms of schedular structure, I'm going to introduce Lena and Michael, and they're going to talk a bit about their work. I have a couple of questions prepared about their work, the media they use, how they use the media, and so on. And we'll also talk about if we as storytellers, as people who decided to pick these stories up, if we are allowed to tell these stories in the first place, or if it's more something that should be sitting in a museum, always put into context by a proper curator, by historians, or can people like us who are just interested in the history and the identity of our families, if they are allowed to tell these stories too. So this is roughly what we're going to talk about. And then this will last about 30 minutes. And then after that, 30, 40 minutes. And after that, if people have questions or want to put questions to the panel, they're more than welcome. And as I said, we will be recording what we're going to talk about now, and we'll share this later also with the audience here. So Lena, maybe let's start with you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your personal story, your family story as well, and why you decided to tell it. So is it that you've discovered the story of your family, or is it more your personal story that brought that into play? So I think your personal journey from Kazakhstan to where you're now is really interesting. So if you could elaborate on that a bit more, that would be really interesting.
Yeah. So I think hi everyone, and hi to New Zealand and America as well. Just wanted to say people joining, and UK as well, and Germany. So for me, I think, well, first of all, I think for me, trying to understand my identity was quite a big issue from very early on. And I think one of the reasons was that growing up in the Soviet Union, and I grew up in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, it was not really talked about. Also, I was part of a minority. I was a German, and Germans were really not liked in anything that had to do with Germany or with German people. Was just very negative. So for me, I think all my childhood, I tried to integrate, and I tried not to be German. in a way, and I wanted to be like the rest of the people, and I wanted to be a Soviet girl, I wanted to be a pioneer, I wanted to be a komsomol, and so on. But most importantly, I think I wanted to belong. But I guess that was also a bit of a contradiction, because on the other hand, I had my grandparents, my grandmothers, who were very strong women, and they used to tell me stories about who they are and where they came from. And I think at some stage I realized they were not from Kazakhstan, and that Germans didn't originally live in Kazakhstan. For a while I thought Germans lived in Kazakhstan. That's just where Germans come from. And then I realized, well, actually they came from somewhere else, and they had a different life before that. And then they started telling me stories about their deportation, and they're also expressing their criticism of the Soviet Union. And for me, that was quite a new thing as well, because I was quite a believer in my country, and believer in communism. So hearing that from my grandparents kind of made me question things. So I was, so for me it was always kind of being kind of in the middle, wanting to belong and integrate, but then also realizing that I was different.
Sorry to interrupt you, Lena, but can I ask you, how old were you when you first heard about these stories about deportation and not being Kazakh?
I think my exposure to being German was probably at the age of 6 or 7, because that's kind of time when I realized that some kids didn't want to play with me because I was a fascist. And that's something that I got to hear from their parents. And so that, I think, was the first time when I realized, when I didn't even know what the name meant. And I remember speaking to my grandma and asking her, and being really upset because some kids didn't want to play with me, asking her what a fascist was. And so that kind of started the explanations, kind of slowly explaining that, fascist is not the same as German, and we are German and we came from this place, and so on. But yeah, that was quite early on. Probably.
And then you came to Germany during the times of Perestroika.
Yeah.
And was that different than coming from Kazakhstan to Germany with knowing that, or were you not even sure what you were at the time?
Well, I think that was similar and different in a way as well, because when I was growing up in Kazakhstan, I was the only German girl in my class. So I was the German girl, and it was just nobody else. It was just me, and so on. So so there was this big thing of wanting to be, belong to this place. And then when we came to Germany, and when we arrived in Germany, I even got a new name. So they decided, Lena is not German enough, we'll give you a new name. We'll call you Helene. It's a beautiful German traditional name that will help you with your integration, and you will be as German as, any German can be. And of course, I then went to school and started school and went to school, and I think it didn't take very long until someone was just going, Helena, the Russian girl. It was just like, I was again alone. There was nobody else who was Russian, and I tried to tell them why I never lived in Russia. I grew up in Kazakhstan, but people, when you're young teenagers, people just don't listen. So I became Helena, the Russian girl. And that was it with me being German, right? So all of a sudden I became the Russian girl, which was kind of strange again, because it was about reassessing my identity. Who am I? So I am not. So in the Soviet Union and Kazakhstan, I was considered German, but also in a way punished for it, for being German. All the history lessons about the evil Germans and the Nazis, it was kind of fascist and German was one and the same word. So people, even the posters that you see from the wartime, a lot of times it was about stopping the Germans. It didn't say stopping Nazi Germans or stopping fascist Germans or anything. It was just stopping the Germans. So the German and fascist was kind of one and the same. And so being in Kazakhstan, it was not cool to be German. And yet everyone pointed it out to me that I was one. And then coming to Germany, everyone was just very busy pointing out to me that I was not German, that I was Helena, the Russian girl, even though I never lived there. So, and I guess those are the conflicting ideas about identity. So it took me a while to figure out who I am. And maybe and I guess that's what inspired my book as well. That's what made me think about creating a book.
And did you decide on the medium of a graphic novel or a comic straight away, or did you just want to tell the story, and the medium didn't matter? So what's the genesis of that idea?
No, I think graphic novel was an idea that I had straight away. I think that was something that I wanted to do from the beginning. And I think one of the reasons for me why I wanted to do it in a graphic novel format is because I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I remember, and they were kind of teenager or younger at that time, and I remember speaking to them about our history, about our Russian-German history, that, to be honest, nobody knows anything about, not even the Russian Germans themselves. And I was kind of talking to them about this history and trying to encourage them to read something about it. And really, I realized that the only books that I could read were like kind of 300 pages long, 400 pages long history books. And I knew that none of my nieces and nephews would be interested to read that. And so what I did is, we first created a slightly different kind of a shorter version of a graphic novel, a presentation. And I realized that people like that. So with Marcel, I can see that Marcel is now showing some screenshots of the current graphic novel that I'm working with. And this particular illustration, this is now in German. That was done with Christopher Krueger is the illustrator. He's attending our session as well. So this particular session is about Kazakhstan. So we're in Kazakhstan, and we're in Kazakhstan. It's just my discussion. I talked to my friend Bibi Gul, and we can see the dust in Kazakhstan. So it's quite a dry and dusty place. And we're going into this garden, and this is the garden that my father planted, and it's quite unusual and large for Kazakhstan, but it's something that's incredibly important for my father. And Bibi Gul talks about it. We talk about it, how if you are, that my father always says that if you have a garden, you will never be lonely. And later in the story, we discover that my father spent his childhood in an orphanage. And which was not a very happy time, but one of the kind of happiest time for him was when he visited one of the teachers, and the teacher had a garden, and so my father promised to have a garden. Those are, and so so those are the slides from, this is now part of history. So this is 1941, and that depicts the deportation in 1941. The trains full with people, mostly women and children, because men were sent on different trains, mostly in a completely different direction. And so this is the story of my grandma and my mother arriving in Kazakhstan, and being told basically in the snow and cold, not really prepared and not really knowing where they were in the first place. So those are the beginning of the new graphic novel that I worked with Christoph together. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll have a couple more questions about the graphic novel, also for Christoph. But I want to introduce our second panelist, which is Michael Sagatis. And Michael, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to show your work, because you're in the trailer for your work, you're introducing yourself and the idea that you had quite nicely. And then I've got 2 more questions for you to follow up on this. So I think we'll do this first. And then I'll let you talk a bit more about your story, the story you're telling, and the medium that you're using. So. Apologies for the delay.
Josefa is a family member that I didn't know about. I know I have a great grandmother, but I was for many, many years unaware of even her name. And then a few years ago, I found a collection of her letters. And then from that point, I made a decision to understand who Josefa was, why these letters were written.
Бачу, як сходить і заходить сонце. Бачу, як вечоріє, сходить місяць і ладні вечірні зорі. А де ж моя Яночка з ладною усмішкою, що мене так тішила?
And Josefa was 76 years old when she was put onto the train and then sent to Kazakhstan, and she was a mother of 6 children. Josefa was repressed because she was given the classification parents of a traitor. So her son, Aloisi, was in the Polish police force and sent to this remote location in North Kazakhstan. She was not in a penal prison gulag where she was doing hard work. She was in a remote settlement, having to work and still pay for her rent and buy food. And from this remote location, Josefa would write, asking for the main requirements for continued survival, which was food and money. She was only writing to her daughters. The earlier letters, she writes about her return and not to sell anything because she's going to come back and she will need them for when she returns. She was still very much organizing the family. As the letters carry on, the tone changes and she doesn't think that she's going to make it back, and then it becomes a different set of letters of one of that she's losing hope.
Ваню, якщо забудете про мене, буде мені тяжко. Але зобов'язую тебе, татуся та Пьотричка, моїх наймиліших, і в найбільших муках не забувати. І це моє прохання завжди має лишатися з тобою. А якщо ти зараз його згубиш, то після смерті моєї сумління в тобі пробудеться. Ще раз прошу докласти зусиль, щоб мене до вас повернути. Ваню моя, образ твій закарбований в серці моїм назавжди. Незважаючи на те, що забули мене. З великим болем на серці закінчую свої сердечні слова. Щиро любляча матір.
When I started making the research and the history, I realized it's not such a personal story because it's the story of so many people. And that then is the legacy of how we think about what these effects are when these huge egos are locked in battle for some new world order.
Every time I watch a trailer, I feel like we should be clapping now, Michael. So the music is so beautiful.
Yes.
So maybe tell us a bit. I would be interested in is your own personal story. Is it as far traveled as Lena, so is your own story the reason why you're doing Joseph's letters, or was it more for you more stationary, that you discovered that family history and then went out? So what's your personal story behind that project?
Well, hi everyone, and greetings, and thanks very much as well for all attending here on your Friday evening. Well, for Lena's perspective, I kind of really can sympathize, because I don't share the vastness, the broadness of it, but I have a similar reaction with respect to knowing that we were born and raised in the UK as a family, but we don't have any direct kind of English heritage or ancestry. And whilst I kind of grew up kind of aware that there was another language being spoken in the house, and that there were stories that were being kind of discussed from time to time, we moved away quite early from that source of the Slavic history, which is from my father's side. So we left London, we moved to Wales, and even then that was the first kind of then taste of experiencing something that was not exactly one homogenous country, even by that movement. So just from moving 200 miles down the M4 to Wales, was my first discovery of something about difference in identity, difference in appreciating a different culture and a different perspective. And that was really something that just made me feel that I was different there, because I was coming from England, and the Welsh thought that anyone coming from England was English, and that they were some form of foreigner. So some kind of similar echoes to how Lena was experiencing being felt as something different because of either from her family background or history. But the whole actual, the Slavic question just remained buried for many, many years. So we moved away from the kind of Slavic history by moving to Wales, which was only being left and preserved by my grandparents that remained in London, and they didn't live for very long. And so it just took maybe 2 decades of time to pass, and of which the world was turning, geopolitical events were turning, and then eventually it was the Slavic kind of history that would come back to find me. So I go back to London to study and work, and then the EU accession of Poland released a load of Poles that came and became based in London, and I would kind of start to get this reconnection with the Slavic past that I knew that I carried. And that would kind of just open me up to kind of becoming more interested, but still only interested from the fact that I was just meeting someone that I had an affinity to, and I still had no real any knowledge of the family history in detail, still for another 10 years. And it was, again, another 10 years or so before other conditions would combine to be able to put this collection of letters in my hand, of which, you know, there was no knowledge of them. They weren't there to be found that I knew of where to look, or that they existed. They just say appeared, and then left me with a choice to make. You know, do I just put them back on the shelf and leave them gathering dust, or you know, should I do something more with them? And I think only because I was in a particular alignment of everything being set up that I could start to inquire and try to understand who wrote these letters and why, which I think is the fundamental question from myself, from my perspective, when they came into my hands. Then began that period of research. So then I would start to discover a lot more of the unpacked history of the region, where the letters were from, and where that family root was grounded in. What terrain, what territory was this root growing from that has spread out? And yes, it involved making these connections to what is present day Belarus and Kazakhstan and the UK, and follows this pattern of displacement as a result of the events from the Second World War that have directly affected individual citizens of these territories, Eastern Europe. Yeah.
If I can ask, because that's really interesting. So you were the one who set out to discover these stories and make them your own. So there was no talk about deportation and the history of Josefa on that side of your father's family. So that was completely new for you when you discovered that.
Correct. I never. It was never some collection of stories kept in the family that we'd always be reminded of and always be told about how bad some country was. We never really heard that. I never heard that. No.
But do you feel, does that make you freer in approaching these stories? I'm just asking because Lena had these stories about deportation and things that happened to her family that were not originally where they're from. And I had the stories of my grandmother about a farm in this lovely place named East Prussia, which was all idyllic and wonderful. And then she was also put on a train. So I think Lena and I, we both had a framework that we could work from to draw these stories from and then fill them in. But to me, it sounds like you had to come up with everything from scratch, right?
Right, Marcel, and I think that's a good way that you said it there, that for sure, I think by having it withheld or omitted in my upbringing, it kind of made me freer with respect to the fact that I wouldn't have to be dwelling on this history, these narratives, hearing some of these sound bites that say this country harmed our ancestors and repeat it. I kind of didn't get that, but I think by the same token, there was still a kind of a gnawing, unsatisfiable itch that says, telling me about, I would still be feeling and continue to kind of feel, but not as much. But certainly there was something away that felt unresolved, which I couldn't put my finger on at all.
That is interesting. And I think I want to ask you a bit about the medium that you use, because the trailer and the whole film about the letters is, I think, 15 minutes long. And I think you just won Best Documentary at the, remind me, the Independent...
Eurasian, it was the Eurasian Film Festival, Best Short Film. Yeah, thank you.
Congrats. But I think you created and set up the exhibition we could see in the trailer. And I think we even composed or commissioned the music that was played. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is why I think there was such a feeling of needing to take this through to this, some can call it the nth degree, a highly kind of commendable degree. My father says it's an obsessed degree and I should stop now, and he's a fine one talking because he composed the music. And I found this music, along with the letters, and there was no, there was no sheet music to speak of. It was just a recording on a cassette, and the story of how this music was able to also be like the letters extracted from oblivion. The two things just seemed to appear there that needed to be joined, and a messenger, a vessel, someone that's going to carry that message. If I didn't do it, I don't think it would never get done. And it was kind of felt like it was the duty to do it for this story, and for the history and for the next generation. Everything that I think also kind of Lena is being motivated by, to be able to say that this is why it needs to be told or why it needs to be preserved. And yes, the museum in Lviv had literally just been opened as the latest and the kind of newest history museum, and they reconstructed these barracks as Lviv suffered the double occupation under the Nazis and the Soviets, and they have, as their own history for their city, used this museum as a faithfully reconstructed camp. With machine gun towers, deportation trains, and the barracks are now high quality museum spaces. So because the exhibition was being held there, it seemed that this was going to be the ideal location with which to shoot a film and film scenes and have scenarios that involve the backdrop of this museum, because it so faithfully represented the the sense of what how the people were being treated and either being exiled, persecuted, and repressed. This was the whole backdrop to really communicate that message.
Thank you. Sorry, Lena. Sorry.
So sorry, I just wanted to say, because I was when I first saw you video on YouTube, and I was impressed, but for me it was so important and touching, is because the musical piece that you created and your father wrote was called Aktubinsk. And this is the city where I grew up and where my family, my grandparents on both sides, my grandmothers and my father and my mother, were deported to Aktubinsk. And so for me, it was a strange sensation, because I never saw Aktubinsk as something to be proud of, because it had always this negative connotation for me and a bit of pain that I felt when I thought about the city. So hearing this music that was called Aktube or Aktubinsk, it just filled me with joy and pride. And so that, for me, it was just absolutely fascinating to meet someone different part of the world whose grandmother was deported to the same place as my parents and my grandparents. And and I just think it was also quite interesting when I was speaking to Michael, and he showed me one of the postcards, and the address on the postcards that was sent on the postcard was sent from Aktubinsk. And I called my parents, and we just looked up where it was located, and it was literally 20 minutes walk from where I grew up. And it's possibly the place where you probably used to go from school, but we were separated, of course, by about 50 years. So from when his grandmother or great-grandmother was there and me living there, but we're still walking the same streets. So I thought that was quite fascinating, quite interesting. Yeah.
And maybe while we're on that topic, maybe we can talk briefly about how your families ended up in Kazakhstan, because I think they ended up there in the same place, but for very different reasons. And I think it might be interesting for some of our viewers who don't know about all these deportations and why and how that happened. If you could maybe just briefly talk about where your family is originally from. Michael already hinted at it. So they were Polish, but they're now in Belarus. So, but maybe Lena, you tell us a bit about
So my family is originally, my family is from, once in southern Russia, Gnadenfeld, and then my mother was born in Ukraine, Blumenfeld, in a village called Blumenfeld. So they were both German Catholic villages, and they were deported in 1941. They were deported as part of the big deportation of all of the Germans. It started with Volga Germans, I believe, or maybe even, maybe not even with, but anyway, 1941, I think in August. There are some people here that would probably know the date much better, maybe the 30th of August, when the big order for deportation was released, and everyone was deported within the matter of months. So my family was from both sides. My mom's and my dad's sides, they were both deported at that time. My mom was just about, I think, 8 or 9 months old, and my dad was about 3 years old when they were deported.
And just to interrupt, just to put this into context, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people.
Yes, so they say about 800,000 people were deported during that time in 1941, and there were more people that came after. And there were more people after the end of the war that were repatriated from Germany as well, that were sent back to the Soviet Union and then sent to either Kazakhstan or Siberia.
And the reason for this deportation is, sorry to interrupt you again, Lena, just to put this into context for the viewers, is that Stalin decided that all the Russian Germans couldn't be trusted because the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht, had just invaded the Soviet Union. So he decided to move them as far away from the front lines as possible. So just by thinking that these people who are living in that area for hundreds of years,
Yes.
they were just
Yeah.
put on a train because he thought they would be traitors.
Yes, that's right. So he believed they were not trustworthy enough, and that was the reason. So my family lived there from about 1760 something, from about 1770. So that's quite a lot of generations. But they were deemed not trustworthy enough. It might be also that he just wanted to punish them as well, because Nazi Germany just attacked Soviet Union. So that might be that as well. But I guess in that regard, he was very efficient at deporting pretty much everyone. And that, of course, ended up in many death cases, even during the transportation. We're talking about thousands of people dead during transportation, and many more horrible things to come, like the work labor camps, Trudarmia, Gulag, and so on. And so yeah, so in my story, I talk about the stories about my grandmothers, my grandma went from work labor camp in Aktubinsk, or close to Aktubinsk, which some people call the other Gulag, and to then escaping it, but then being captured and then being sentenced to 20 years in Gulag in Vorkuta, which is north of the Arctic Circle. And I even looked up the distance, and then her son was sent to an orphanage, and I don't know. I will need to research that more. But I've heard, so his name was changed, and I kind of asked so it took her very, very long time to find her child, and there are many things that I tried to research, and that was one of my questions as well. Was it common that the names were changed of the children? And I spoke to many people where they agreed. They said, yes, a lot of orphans received different names, and maybe it was for the purpose so that the enemies of the state, speak Germans who received this Gulag sentence, would not find their children. I'm not sure, but that was definitely the case with my father and my grandmother. So it took her a very long time to find him. So yeah, and I looked up the distance. So the distance between Vorkuta, where she was located, and he was sent to an orphanage in Ukraine, and orphanage for the children of the enemies of the state, which was very charming as well. Not like I find that fascinating as well, just like to think about it. Like, it wasn't called like birch tree or happiness. It was just like for the children of the enemies of the state.
You were told what you were from the beginning. Every day you reminded of
yeah, exactly. Who are you? Yes, I'm the child of the enemy of the state. Fantastic. But I mean, my father even said, because there were different children within this orphanage, right? They were different because Soviet Union had a lot of different enemies of the states, right? Of the state. So it might be someone who was anti-communism or a communist or something else, someone who stole potatoes or whatever else it was. But he did say that within even this hierarchy of all these different children, being German was kind of quite low position, because it's still wartime and they're still fighting the patriotic war against the Nazis, and being a child with a German name in the orphanage was not easy, definitely. So it's kind of like on the bottom, it's bad to be an orphan in this orphanage, but being German there was just like kind of the worst of the worst. So he did what anyone would do, and maybe what I did, we all do to survive. And he tried to forget all of his German identity as much as he could, learn Russian as quickly as you can, become proper pioneer, and so on. And I guess I repeated the same things, but I guess that's just a normal human condition. We survive, we adjust, we integrate. That's what we need to do. But I just want to say the distance between Vorkuta and the orphanage that you were sent to, I looked at it, was about 2,600 kilometers. And that kind of made me think, because I live in London and my parents are in Frankfurt. And so sometimes I do complain about the distance. And then I just looked up the distance, and there's something like 670 kilometers between London and Frankfurt. So it's just like, it's not really that much if you compare it to the Gulag and what was the distance that they were separated by.
Every time I hear this, I'm so baffled by these distances, and you know, that the apparatchiks and Stalin decided, we just move these people around, but that it meant like an immense operation with thousands of trains, with 10,000s of guards and hundreds of thousands of people moving them around, sorting them out all over the Soviet Union. And that's just, it just baffles me. And
sorry, I just wanted a very quick thing. I just want to say, this very same orphanage, and I didn't know it until recently, but because I've been doing all this research, the orphanage was located in a village that used to be an old Mennonite village. And before the war, there were about 1,000 people living in that village, all German Mennonites. And this orphanage was an old German school. And it's just made me think, because all those people, those people disappeared from that village, and I don't know what happened to them. They were deported, you know, to Siberia or to Central Asia. So none of them remained in that village, but the school, still the German school, a good enough building to accommodate an orphanage, still stayed behind. And I found it quite ironic that then quite a few German orphans were then located in that, you know, were placed in that, what used to be a German village school.
And this interesting, just to mention that, this Soviet way of reutilizing good material. So for example, in Yekaterinburg, which was Sverdlovsk, which is the place where my grandmother ended up in quite a few camps, they still have to this day a German area, which was literally, or there's still a few leftovers there, which was the area where the German forced laborers were kept, and they had to build their own kind of accommodation. But because the buildings were so good, people thought, okay, that's good German quality labor, so we keep the place, and they call it the German corner, the German village, to this day. But I want to ask Michael as well. So your family they were also traitors, right? But they were exported before the Second World War started.
Yeah, exactly right. For the same lexicon that Lena was referring to, that Soviet lexicology of enemies of the state, anti-communist elements, right? So they were found guilty, and especially because of the police force connection in the family. So my Josefa's son was a police officer, and that immediately put him in the category. So under the Soviet categorization of who is exactly an enemy, you had these different levels of categories, with the highest, most intelligent being the biggest threats, carrying the thoughts of rebellion and how to resist the Soviet occupation, all the way down to other kind of influential members of society, priests and teachers. So they were all targeted. But police officers were fairly high ranking in terms of the threat level, and that's that was the profession of a grand uncle. And the last family photo of Josefa and the family show them all gathered there together, and the grand uncle is there in his full police uniform. So you can actually see that he would have been a clear target. And it was about 1938, that photo. Just about 1 year before the invasion of Poland, and immediately these lists, these kind of much kind of understood as being very scary documents of the Soviet state police drawing up their lists, and much feared lists, would put these names down. So the names were put on there, and then the NKVD, the then Polish Soviet KGB forces, security forces, would be looking to try and apprehend and liquidate if not arrest and send to the hard labor camps, they'd be trying to execute them. So Granduncle Alex was squarely in the sights of the NKVD during this initial invasion period of 1939. They couldn't get him. They didn't manage to he escaped and he evaded capture. And he was the only son of the rest of this family. There was just Josefa and her daughters. They didn't target the daughters, but they targeted the mother of Alex, Josefa, and they applied another form of Soviet criminal code of that Josefa, being the mother of this police officer, was herself a traitor, but by definition. And so she was repressed under the parent of a traitor criminal code. And so that was their reason for justifying her deportation and forced exile, to be forced out of, then taken from the family home. As was, over 1.2 million of the residents of Eastern Poland at that time, over that period of 1940 to 41 in 1 year, there were these 4 waves of mass deportations of Poles, of Balts, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, all mixtures of ethnicities, nationalities, and anyone that represented this threat to Stalin in his eyes. And yes, that would have been how Josefa ended up on the cattle train alone at the age of 76. And she was transported 2,500 kilometers to Kazakhstan, taking about 3 weeks on that train journey to get there. Again, a train journey of which many of the old, the ill, and the young would have just died on a 3-week train journey across Russia, Central Asia. And again, somehow, Josefa's strength of spirit, she's able to endure that. And whilst then, when she ends up in Kazakhstan, this is the start of the letter writing process for her. And she's writing the letters and sending them back to her children, of which her youngest daughter is my grandmother, who makes then the opposite journey. So whilst Josefa is repressed and sent eastwards on a one-way ticket that she would never return from, so she's buried in the steppe in Kazakhstan. Her daughter Vanda would take the decision to leave the ruins of Eastern Europe after the war and risk her life as the refugee to come to the West. So she, in a way, the whole narrative of Josefa's repression to the East is a strongly motivating factor as to why her children would go West. Yeah.
And sorry, Michael, she was deported 1940, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's for me really interesting to know, because of course all Russian Germans were deported in 41. So in my mind, all the history of deportation starts in 1941. And then I remember speaking to you and you said, no, it happened much earlier. And then I started reading that there were Koreans who were deported already in 39, I think in 38. So that's quite interesting to know. So that's something that didn't just start with the, once the Nazi Germany invaded Soviet Union, kind of, not 1941, but also before.
Yes, the start of the deportations, the start of aggression against the Poles started even before the commencement of World War II. There was the Polish operation by the NKVD that made very, very strong targeting and executions of thousands and thousands of Poles, considered by the Poles today as a genocide against the Poles. And yes,
sorry to interrupt. Even Tsarist Russia had a history of deporting Poles to the east, because there were the Polish uprisings in the 19th century. So even then, even before communism, Stalinism came along, even then there was this tradition, for want of a better word, of sending unwanted people east. So it's just something that the communists latched onto that was already well underway under the Tsar.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious of time because we're almost at the hour. And before we take audience questions, I wanted to ask you to, how do you feel about telling these stories? Because that's the thing that I'm not a trained historian. I'm not anyone who has any kind of professional training to tell these stories or put them into context. I just thought that the story of my grandmother was one worth telling because she was such an important person to me. So that's why I decided to write that book. And I wanted to ask you both, is it similar for you, or is it sometimes intimidating, seeing all this deportation, this horror, this trauma? Is that we sometimes think, no, we should maybe go away from it and tell it differently, or is it for you equally emotional and important to tell these stories? Maybe Lena, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's very easy to, in my case, to forget this history. And in fact, my parents, every time I ask them any questions, they just go, why do you want to talk about it? Why do you want to bring up the past? Just why do you need to do that? And I think for me, it was very important because it made me understand where I came from. Because when I was growing up, I had this dark and unknown thing about our roots. I just literally didn't know where we came from. Did my ancestor just somehow landed in the Russian Empire? Where did I come from? It was just lack of kind of stability and understanding. So researching this history is, I have to say, it's highly traumatic. To be honest, I think there were so many days where I cried just reading the terrible history, and I cried and cried again. But I think and I might be speaking for many Russian Germans, and I'm generalizing, but Russian Germans were very quiet and silent about their history for a very long time. And I feel that it's the time now to talk about it, but also not just talk about it, but also to be proud of who they are. And the issue that the Russian Germans are not considered, so in Germany, they're not really seen as someone, as fantastic people. And in Russia, it's neither the case. So anyway, for me, I think it's, what I want to say is, after reading and researching and learning about this history, I just realized how incredibly strong those people are, how incredibly strong my grandmothers were. And now when I think about them, I'm proud. And so when I look at other Russian Germans now, I now understand what they all went through in order just to survive. And I'm proud of them. And that's a picture that I want to paint. So no more Russian Germans being silent and being ashamed of who they are, but now it's Russian Germans, the strong people, and what they have achieved, and that just the fact that they survived in such a unfriendly, hostile environment is just something to be proud of. That's me. Did I answer the question?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I felt so encouraged to tell the story of my grandmother. She wasn't interested. She told me a lot of these stories, but more in the sense of a fairy tale. And then it was up to me to piece it together and put it into a narrative. But I felt, even though I started the whole project after she died, I felt it was so important for me to tell that story because she was such a strong and important person for me, like for you. And Michael, what's it like for you? Because you don't have that personal connection to that person to latch onto, talking about your great grandmother. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whilst I had a few fleeting memories of the grandparent generation, there was still nothing there concrete to really say why would I still continue to be interested in the history. But then I think it was more about exactly still what was happening in my immediate family with more of the kind of personal composition of my own siblings and next level up, so kind of aunts and uncles, that there were things happening within the family history that in kind of immediate family history that I couldn't understand, or there seemed to defy an explanation as to what was going on with respect to how people were behaving and how their states of mental health were as well, and physical health, and how they were affecting each other. And this question of the mental and physical health and how they're affecting each other was something that's been a dominant theme within my own kind of family life, trying to understand that growing up. And it came to a point where lots of things were being kind of tried to try and help and kind of diagnose condition or something like this, and it wasn't, nothing was kind of coming and giving an answer. And only, again, without never having heard about it and not knowing about the direction it was going to take me, the start of the family history research was something that happened as the result of a passing of a family member. So that was an aunt who died, and she herself was very, very eccentric and led a very, very eccentric life. And that eccentricity was something that I was at a loss to explain. My father couldn't put the finger on why and how come she led this eccentric life. And there were echoes of this eccentricity coming through, the next generation. Hands up, it might be, me as well as my own, certainly in my own sibling, cohort. And I wanted to know more about that. So I used the history as a way of firstly trying to understand more about the root to how we all came to be. But by doing that, I also then became introduced and understood more about topics like transgenerational transmission of trauma and how intergenerational effects, as a result of the effects of hard history, the kind of history that Lena's referring to, about just what kind of hostile environments and places our ancestors have been through. And given at the various points that they've experienced it, what has that imparted onto the next generation, either through the stories that have left and created an epigenetic effect, or if not through the stories and the way that the behaviors have potentially shaped and altered a next generation, but actually directly at the time of when an ancestor is about to form the next generational link. So if you're going to create the next generation, and we're talking about under what conditions were those links being formed in the chain. So we're literally, now on starting a whole new field of scientific research that's discussing how the secrets and the pasts and the hidden and unknown elements of a family history have a direct bearing on their psychodynamic effects in the current and potentially future generations, which is it's a whole new field of contemporary science that's looking at the effects and the impacts of history on today. So that's been certainly one big motivator. And of course, as an aside and a very kind of very clear kind of banner now to connect the past to the present, we are seeing just part of the history repeats itself in Eastern Europe, in the same, for me personally, in the same place where this story and history started, and whatever transgenerational, intergenerational echoes and effects that may be happening took place in Belarus for me 3 generations ago, and here I am witnessing mass upheaval in Belarus today, and I'm a far better informed and equipped mentally and with the tools to understand not only potentially understand more about the history of this area, but also to understand the effects of the current repressive regimes that are exacting and meting out their punishments upon a population today, and to have a better idea then of the intergenerational effects that the next generation of Belarusians are going to have to carry, notwithstanding the previous burden of their already hard history, which is something that needs to be mindful of. We need to be mindful of. Yeah.
But I think also for us as storytellers, that is crucial. So for me, when I approached the story of my grandmother, and I knew these stories about the place where she came from, she was deported and then went to the west of Germany, never returned home. So even after the wall fell, the Iron Curtain came down, she never went to the place that had been East Prussia and is now the
do you know why? Because that's interesting. Do you know why?
We tried to coax her in and doing that journey, but she always talked about doing it, and then we were entering the phase of the practical planning of it. She always didn't want to do it. Maybe it's because, and this is something that affected me, and that's why I'm mentioning that, because she created this ideal of home in her mind. And East Prussia was not an ideal and wonderful place. It was a place with loads of conflicts, especially in society, between the landowners and the very poor people who lived there. But it was, in her mind, it was that perfect place, this wonderful farm right next to a lake where she used to go swimming. And I knew all these stories, and she went to church in a sleigh in winter, and there were wolves in the woods. So it was a wonderful story to hear. But I thought that telling that story, I would have a bit of a professional distance. But last year I was privileged enough to spend half a year as the official writer in residence of Olsztyn, the German Einstein in northern Poland. And we actually went to the place where that farm was, me and my dad, who came to visit me. And he cried. And for me, it was highly emotional, even though it was a place I had never seen. Like my upbringing is in the west of Germany, and now my life is in Ireland. But even I was emotionally touched just by being in that place, because I knew the area through her stories and what happened there. So that touched me as a storyteller even more, and it felt even encouraging to go out and talk more, like we're doing now, to talk more about these stories. I think we can, if you two are happy with that, I think we'll end our part of the evening now, and see if there are questions from the audience. There's at the at the bottom right, there's the reactions button. So if anyone who has a question can either wave their hand or give me the thumbs up, and then I'll call them out. If not, we can talk 5 or 6 minutes more, but I don't want to keep anyone, because we said we're going to leave this at 1 hour. So if anyone has a question for the panel, please let us know.
Yep. Alison has a question. Alison, can you speak?
Hi, I have never been among people that understood, who were not my immediate family, who understood this transgenerational trauma, who understood the history of the deportations. My family is Polish. My family went to Arhangelsk and has migrated all the way through, whether it was India or Africa. So these are the stories that I embodied with. And I'm the only one in the family who this is now what I carry. So I'm a performance PhD at University of California in San Diego. And so my research is on memorials and museums in places of trauma, specifically looking at these embodied elements. And so what I'm hearing is the way in which you have taken these different creative outlets to share the stories. And I have so many questions, but to have a conversation more, but my question specifically is, have you encountered, whether it's through museums or memorials, the reception for people that don't understand? And so that's something that I'm interested in. Is we get it. If I go to certain sites, I feel this connection, kind of like Michael said, or I don't understand it. But what about for people that, how do we communicate these important stories to people that don't have a connection to the material? And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
For Michael or
I have thoughts on that, but if you want to,
Go on, Marcel. No, go on, please, Marcel.
I think the question is more, are people maybe not aware of their own family history? Because the more that I learn about the topic and more about these forced migrations and deportations and you know, the trauma of the Second World War, is I think many people in Europe have similar stories in their history, so and their family history. So I think it's not really about approaching somebody who is a blank slate, who has lived in this one place all of the time, and they go to a museum or memorial to learn about this. I think for the majority of people in the former Soviet Union and in all countries of Europe especially, there is a shared kind of aspect of that. And even if it's just having the trauma of the Second World War affecting the family in one way or the other without being deported or something. So I think it's not really about telling a story and telling trauma from in very simple ways, saying this is what happened, this is what you have to learn, this is how you can learn more about it. I think it's really about providing context and making that accessible instead of telling a simple story. And I think these are the museums, memorials that I identify most with. If they would tell me the context, if they would tell me, okay, this is not this horrible thing, this traumatic thing happened, and these are the reasons why. This is why somebody in Berlin decided it would be fine to have a police unit from Stuttgart sent to Poland and use them as mass murderers. And how did it affect these people who were the mass murderers? Why were the people, you know, it always, for me, it always has to be about context, telling me why it happened. And I think this is also an angle that will work for most people because there is this shared history in all of Europe.
I just would like to say that for me, I think when I started, first when I didn't fully know my history, but I felt that burden. Maybe that's what Alison talks about. I'm not sure, but I remember I used to speak to anyone about the kind of deportations and horror of the story without really understanding it all. And I remember some people actually used to say to me, they just don't want to hear that. It's just too much. And I got to hear that quite a few times, especially like not the best topic of conversation at workplace or something, on some kind of Christmas do or something. And you just go, oh, you know, my family came from and so on, and they suffered. So I just realized it's a topic that interested me, and it took me a while to, maybe after I started understanding it and researching it for myself, I calmed down. I didn't have this urge anymore to speak it out about it all the time. But also when I started doing researching, I actually found quite a lot of or people that were interested in the same topic. And so that helped me. So now I don't feel isolated. I now know quite a lot of people that love to listen to me. And I mean, I go for runs here in London with my friends. They don't know much about Russian-German culture, but I tell them anyway, and they have to listen because we run together. So that's how I do it. Sorry, that just... But yeah, there will be probably, I come across quite a lot of people who don't want to know anything about it. And that's fine. And I guess that's just their choice. And it's about finding out what's the right thing for you. I don't know, Alison, is that something? Maybe Michael also, I know that you were involved with putting up the memorial in Aktubinsk, I think, or you had some kind of connection, which was incredibly impressive.
Well, I think just to hit, if I can understand Alison's question as well about the idea of, for the people who don't know, I mean, if we are understanding and accepting us getting more and more globalized, homogenized, and we still refer to phrases like the global village, I still think that implies that if that is the case, that we are a global village, that we still then have villages of which there are stories attached to know which village we come from. And I think if we know that which village we are from, we have a better understanding of ourselves, and that's something that you can help share to other people who also come from a village somewhere. And everyone's got that story that they may have heard it from their own particular tribe or village. They'll hear it from someone else's. But if you are going to try and present it in the context as to then how does that actually potentially affect, which is what the research is kind of trying to lead us to show us and present to us, findings that life in the modern world, in our highly globalized world, has got links to the past and what ancestors have been through in the past, i.e. from what village they came from. And if you can get someone who hasn't got an idea of what those effects are, then I've been, from what I've managed to use the project as a platform to kind of try to creatively share and express elements of how the history has connected through and expressed it through photos and video and music. This has just been a way of finding a creative platform as well to communicate that message. Yeah. I don't know if Alison is.
And I'm pretty sure if you have
back, would you like to give any feedback or another question?
No, just I appreciate that. I don't want to monopolize. I just, everyone has different creative outlets, and it's, when I look at memorials and museums, I always just wonder, what is it like for people that who don't share that knowledge, and how do they, because you've have different mediums than performance. I was just curious, but no, I appreciate all of the comments and the feedback, and this is of course becoming notes for me to follow up on more research later.
Happy to hear that. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, maybe just one more point on that topic, and then we can wrap it up. The most, for me, touching monument or memorial are actually the Stolpersteine in Germany, the stumbling stones, which are these little memorials that are actually dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust, and they're being set in the pavement in front of the houses where these people used to live. So you get the name, state of birth, the date when they perished in the Holocaust, what happened to them in a very nutshell. And they're being set up all over Germany by an artist named Günther Demning for the last 30 years. So there are thousands of them by now. Some people don't like them because they're in the ground, so you can walk over them, across them. But for me, it's that one thing, it brings you back to the place and the person. So it's not about the whole massive trauma of the Holocaust or the whole history of the Gulag. It's that one person that lived in that one house and what happened to them. And I often feel that this is a similar approach that I have to telling the story of my grandmother. Is it feels like if you can show by one example of how these massive crocks of totalitarianism affected one person and their family, I think it's much more effective storytelling and leads to much more empathy for people who have not experienced that or have not heard about that, than coming with a big book and slapping them and said, need to learn about all the train journeys that went on. So I think if you focus on these smaller aspects, that's really effective in terms of also teaching people of how these contexts work, how historical context. And that's really important, especially during these days when all the politicians and leaders, and especially the right-wing populists across Europe, they tell very, very simple stories and very easy to follow stories. But we as humans, we're not easy to follow. We have complex feelings, complex minds, and complex stories. And I think this is what the three of us are telling, that history and personal experience is always complex, and people have to remember that. Yeah.
So there was a question by Bill.
Not so much a question, more just a comment. These stories, your stories need to be told. You know, I read Marcel's book about his grandmother and didn't know that happened. You know, we go to school and you get taught about the Second World War, and you get taught about Hitler and Churchill and Eisenhower and whoever. You do not get taught the stories of individual people, and that's what makes history. And we really need to teach this everywhere. But of course, if we don't know it, we can't teach it. So these stories are absolutely vital to let other people know what happened. And hopefully also it would be wonderful if that made sure it never happened again. But who knows what's going on just now in the world. But the stories must be told. And thank you for telling these stories either in book form already, as I've read Marcel's one about his grandmother, or the two of you tonight. It is very moving, but that is what history is. It's individual people and what happened to them. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
I think my dream and my goal would be that one day when I am anywhere in the world, be it in England or New Zealand or Spain, when people ask me, you know, where you're from, and I can say, I'm a Russian German, or I'm a German from Russia, and people actually would know what it means. So I would not need to spend half an hour explaining Second World War history or First World War history, but people would actually know. That would be a goal achieved.
It's a very small task you've given yourself, Lena.
Yes. Okay. Setting goals. Yes. Thank you. Okay.
Excellent. Then I would like to thank both of you for joining tonight. It was a fantastic talk. Thanks a lot. And also would like to thank the audience for sticking with us. I hope it was interesting and entertaining for you. So we might do more of that kind of online chat. It was just an idea that we had, and I think it worked really well. So we might do more on that. Keep your eyes peeled for Lena's book that will be coming out soon.
Yes, Christoph is laughing. Yes, it will be, well, I think the plan is for it to come out by August next year to commemorate the deportations from 1941, the 80 years. So yeah, Christoph will be working hard trying to achieve that goal.
Good luck with that, Lena. And yeah, be happy to read anything you can send me. So be glad to do it.
Great. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, day, afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks a lot for joining. And as I mentioned in the chat, we'll share the link to the recording in the Facebook event. And also, I think we're all individual channels and networks. So thanks again. I really enjoyed that. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.